So they've tracked fires across the United States from 1985 to 2020. And they go up at a steady rate, both in size and number. So that's really, really important that the scientists have actually determined that. But what's even more impressive is that on the map that they've got, which projects changes in the number of days of fires in the United States, right through the rest of this century, guess where the most red dots are? My God, Texas.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Climate Emergency Forum. My name is Regina, and I'm your host as we discuss Texas on fire. As we record this very moment, Texas is on fire, and it has been on fire for quite some time. And of course, I'm speaking about the Smokehouse Creek fire that's hitting the panhandle of Texas. It's now spread over to Oklahoma. And we have been told for decades, Professor Hansen told us, and other climate scientists told us, that we could expect to see an increase in fires across our nation and across the world. And in fact, that is exactly how things have panned out for us. We've seen state after state, as well as country after country, go up in flames. And the consequences, of course, are not small. The thing about the Southwest, it's particularly vulnerable to fires due to a combination of factors, which includes, of course, primarily warmer temperatures. Then there have been droughts, year after year droughts, and prolonged periods of dry conditions. This has led to the perfect storm for burning up the state of Texas. So I'm going to speak to March 8th. Now we're recording on March 12th, 2024, but from the last recording of March 8th, over 1 million acres have been burned across the state of Texas. It makes it the largest wildfire in Texas history. Now, what are the effects of this? Of course, thousands of people have been left without homes. Thousands of people are without electricity, and human beings have lost their lives, as well as untold amount of other non-human animals. Now, it's terrifying if you've seen the footage and you see the encroaching fire leading up to these massive farms that grow cattle, and the reaction of the cattle is just so frightening. They know what's going on. They're sentient beings. They're intelligent, knowing beings. And seeing the fear well up in their eyes and seeing them try to outrun this fire when they're in fact caged into the fire it's just such a heart-wrenching sight to see. That alone makes this such a tragedy. But it's very important to know that the wildfire in Texas, and of course, we're going to broaden this topic to wildfires in general, have so many other repercussions. And the state of Texas, it has a varied economy, agriculture being one of them. It also has aerospace and defense is a large portion of the economy. Energy is a large portion of the economy. Healthcare and biotechnology is also a very large portion of the state's economy. And I want to mention that Texas is the second largest economy in the country, second only to California. So cattle is indeed a huge part of the economy, and it reflects $12.5 billion annually to the state of Texas. And so to lose so much money just for it to go up in flames is would be very difficult for any state and any country. And I want to speak to, of course, we here on the Climate Emergency Forum advocate for a vegetarian diet. We advocate for not consuming beef because, of course, it is very, very bad for the planet, for the land. forests are torn down so that cattle can graze. These are all known things. But let's just look at the benefits of the cattle industry in Texas. Education is a huge, huge part of Texas. There are many major universities. Educational institutions get money from the tax revenue from the cattle industry. A tremendous amount of funding comes from the cattle industry. Not only that, the healthcare sector also receives a lot of funding from the cattle industry, from the tax revenue. Lastly, I will say that ranchers, while they do get a bad rap, I'm not saying it's completely undeserved, but they also play a huge role in conservation. So losing that is going to be very painful for any state. And I have more to discuss, but right now I want to turn it over to Peter, who has a lot to share about wildfires as well. Peter, I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Regina. Yeah, so I periodically check the fire maps. Copernicus does one, and NASA Firms does one. And there's very little on the media at present on the Texas fire. So I had naively assumed that everything was okay. Well, it's not okay. It's hardly any better at all. The fire agency reports that they've got 85% of the fires contained, but that essentially means that the fires are just as large as they ever were. So they've been going on for a long, long, long time. So when I look at the Copernicus fire map, which is very good because it tells me how much heat it's giving off, it's just stunning. It's absolutely stunning. About a third of eastern United States is covered with red, orange, and yellow dots, literally covered. And you can see that the fires are extended. There are fires generally in Texas right now, but they're mainly in northern Texas now, I think has been reported. But the fire sort of corridor goes right up to the Southern Lakes, goes right up to Illinois. So it's hardly surprising that this is the worst fire in the history of the state of Texas, and I think the second worst fire in the history of the United States. It's pretty basic, isn't it? I mean, you don't need any models to know that if you're increasing the global surface temperature rapidly, you're going to have more heat waves, you're going to have more wildfires, you're going to have more droughts. So that is the world we're living in now. This is not the same world that I came into or most people came into. This is a substantially disrupted, deranged world that we're living in. So the next question, of course, is, well, how bad is it going to get, right? And we're hearing this question quite a lot. Well, the scientists aren't being very helpful there because the scientists are pretending that we can still limit warming to 1.5 degrees C, which is absolutely absurd. What we need to be focusing on and what we need to focus our governments on, and normally we would expect the scientists to do this, is the real scenario, the real world scenario of where we are headed on global warming, because of course that will determine the forest fires and the droughts, etc. Well, you may be surprised to hear, because I checked it recently, that with the 2023 record global warming, we are actually tracking above the very, very worst case scenario. That's not out there at all. The scientists aren't indicating this whatsoever. They're just keeping on talking about 1.5 degrees C. So that means that we're headed, as the IPCC 6th assessment helpfully and accurately told us on the present policies, we're headed for a warming of over 3 degrees C. That is literally a world on fire. That is literally a world burning down. That is literally an unlivable world. Once we get to 2 degrees C, we have a catastrophic climate situation worldwide. So, people are mentioning this 3 degrees C, but they just mention it. I mean, this is an end of the world temperature increase. Absolutely, literally. What we should be doing, and the scientists and everybody should be doing, is they should be putting the policymakers, government's nose to the grindstone, as it's called, and telling them, look, what you are doing, and of course UNEP helpfully told us that government plans are for double the fossil fuel production and expansion. in the next, but well, by 2030, right? So we are headed for absolute climate catastrophe. So that is really what these fires should be telling us, right? Right? Unprecedented fires worldwide are going to get a hell of a lot worse. They're going to get far, far, far worse. The only real prevention, we're hearing a lot about prevention and adaptation, but what I seldom read is that what the response that we have to do is what the IPCC assessment told us to do, which is put global emissions into decline right away. Quote, immediately, quote, rapidly. I mean, my God, how much are we going to take? And how much are we going to lose for the future? So the fires are a big, big message for us.
Thank you so much, Peter. Absolutely. Drawing down emissions right away yesterday is the most imperative thing that we can do. Our governments are not acting. And, Paul, I know that you were witness, as well as Peter, to the fires in Canada. How do you feel that this compares, and what do you think this is telling us for the future?
Yes, thank you, Regina and Peter. So just first to reiterate what Peter said, I mean, global average temperatures are on a tear. In the US in February, the temperature was 4.1 Celsius above average. For December, January, February, in our winter, the US temperatures were 3 Celsius above average. And in Canada, they were 5.1 Celsius above average. Of course, as you go to further north, you have the amplified warming. And Regina, you mentioned that it's the warmer weather, the droughts, and the dry conditions that lead to these, huge wildfires. But I'd also like to add that when we get rain, it's often torrential and it's often in short bursts. And often in preceding the droughts and the drying, there's lots of rainfall, and then that stimulates a lot of growth of vegetation. So then when it does become, when we do have a heat wave and drought and drying, there's lots of dead brush that acts as fuel for these fires and making them worse. Now, Texas on fire, I'll give a little bit of gallows humor here. Texas is world famous for charbroiled steak. So now you can go to Texas and get your charbroiled steak without even going into a restaurant. You can just go out onto the field and have it. So this is my gallows humor. It's a double whammy with these fires, because not only do we get organic plant material that's burned, so we lose that carbon sink. The plants are very important for photosynthesis, for taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So when they burn, all that carbon from the plant material goes into the atmosphere, but the burning often goes down into the soils. And there's a lot of organic carbon that is stored in soils, and that, of course, can burn and contribute to the amount of carbon released into the atmosphere, because these fires are burning very, very hot. So gallows humor number 2 is that biochar is very important in soils. So the fire is actually generating a lot of biochar within the soils directly. You don't have to put it in the soils. Now, in the context of the globe, of course, we've had, last year is fresh in people's memory in Canada, the massive record number of acres hectares burned in Canada, far exceeded any previous records by a factor of like 4 or 5, I believe. A few years prior to that, there was a massive fires in Australia that were just unprecedented. And you might remember literally billions of animals, of the wildlife, being killed in these Australian fires. So what do we do? How do we get better at fighting fires? Well, Australia, over 90% of the firefighters in Australia are now volunteers. So the government will go and put firefighting equipment in small towns in the outback. The volunteers are trained as to use the equipment to fight fires. So the idea is that when a fire is starts, you can put it out before it spreads and becomes a massive fire in Australia. In Canada, there's calls, there's a lot of politics between the federal government and the provinces as to who fights the fires, and it's mostly the provinces. But there is a call for a national firefighting force in Canada, which again would be heavily volunteers. We need to train loads of volunteer firefighters. I think that's probably the most effective way that we can deal with these fires. But one of the problems historically in Canada is because our population density is so low that when a fire starts, if it's not threatening a town or a road or a rail or a structure, it's just left to burn out. And it usually does burn out by the, when the fall comes, when the colder weather comes in the fall. But now that these fires are starting much earlier you may be able to do that when the fire starts in July or August. But when the fire starts, now or in April, May, to just let it burn all summer without putting it out, it doesn't seem to make any sense to me. So people all around the world need to really look at this new fire regime and, get resources to actually try to address this problem, because it's not going away with global warming.
Thank you so much for presenting the other various aspects of fires, wildfires, and the problems that they cause us. And, while your kind of gallows humor regarding the beef being cooked right before our eyes, it's not the first time we've seen something like this. And in fact, in 2021, along the northwestern part of the United States, in British Columbia and Vancouver, thousands and thousands of mussels cooked in their shells. You could have walked along the beach and had yourself a fancy feast there. And millions of sea creatures just literally burned to death due to that tremendous heat wave, the combined warmth of the ocean and the sun. So while we can make our climate change jokes, and it does help us to have a degree of humor about these things, it's also quite tragic. It's quite tragic that we live in a world where these creatures are literally being cooked alive where they live. So it's really quite frightening. And I'm going to turn it back to Peter to hear some more of his thoughts regarding the heat, its consequences, and of course, wildfire, which is our topic for this show.
So that was very interesting. Thanks both. Let's look at the world. It's interesting to me that actually it's only relatively recently that the data and the research has confirmed that yes, forest fires are in actual fact increasing. The history is very difficult for the scientists has been until recently to sort of translate. So fires have doubled worldwide in the past 20 years or so. The big news right now, or it should be the big news right now, is that the Amazon is burning as never before. This early in the year, February, far more of the Amazon rainforest is burning than has ever happened in the past. And as I've said, we've got a good handle on this because Copernicus and NASA provides us these excellent satellite maps where you can see the fires in real time, basically. The worry of the Amazon burning worse than ever is, of course, the Amazon is approaching very rapidly the long anticipated tipping point at which the Amazon rainforest, or the vast majority of it, collapses, turns to savanna. Massive amount of carbon, of course, gets released as the fires in the Amazon get worse and worse. And I'm afraid they're bound to get worse and worse because nothing's being happening about slowing down our emissions whatsoever. So in the context of the real practical context, as I say again, of what our governments are doing and where we're heading is, yeah, we've lost the Amazon. Yeah, we've lost the barrier reef. The barrier reef is in a major bleach. That is, I think, the fifth major bleach. And there was only one or two before 2016, so there's far more. And that's hardly surprising because we do all know, because of the media, that the sea surface temperature worldwide has been absolutely record, totally out of sight from any information before. And the coral reef experts, they've confirmed that the barrier reef is in a major bleach. That is that the heat on the surface of the water has forced the little organisms out of the coral, and that will lead, if it's repeated and repeated, to coral death, which is happening. I just want to then reconfirm the Amazon. It's not only extraordinary. An extraordinary thing about the present Amazon fire is that the northern Amazon burning more than anywhere else, and that's never happened before. The northern Amazon is the wettest and it's the least vulnerable to fire. So, as I say, for God's sake, how much do we want to lose?
It's a good question, Peter. I'll leave it to you to answer that, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, Peter's brought up, excellent points, as you have, Regina. I want to talk a little bit more about these sort of the science of these heat waves and so on. So, we often get a very powerful jet stream ridge, which is stationary or locked in place. So there's very few clouds underneath that ridge area, high pressure, relentless heat can pound down on the earth. And of course, we get a drying out of all of the vegetation. Water is drawn out of the plants, water is drawn out of the soils. There's something we call a vapor pressure deficit, which builds and builds and builds. You get this sort of powerful, array of physical factors, which leads you to these long-term heat waves and the jet stream becoming stuck in place. And this is what we're seeing more and more often. It was a very relevant factor over Australia for those fires. It's a very relevant factor over Canada and also for the fires in the US. We need to really get our governments moving at all levels to figure out what to do to better respond, to be more resilient to these fires, because the bureaucracy tends to be slow. In Canada, the firefighting mostly falls on the provinces. The federal government can provide some funding to the provinces for that, but there's a lot of that slows down the fact that there's provincial and federal governments involved. Is a bureaucratic process, right? We need, like I said, a national firefighting service, but I don't think we've learned anything in Canada based on what happened last year. I think the US is similar. I think that the states basically run the firefighting with maybe some money, unless it's a national disaster and, FEMA's called in and the federal government's called in. In Canada, we did have some military being called in and involvement. So that's basically federal to come and fight these fires, but it's all sort of ad hoc. There's nothing organized. And we need to look closely, I think, at what the Australian government has done, because they've had this problem for a lot longer than we've had it in North America. It's starting to take off so much in North America that, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can look at what Australia has done. But we really need to basically train people to put out fires before they get out of hand. There's a certain amount of fires that you want burning. That's sort of a natural situation to have some amount of burning. I'll bring the example of Australia. Indigenous people having prescribed burns for tens of thousands of years in Australia. They'll let some fires go for a certain time because it's very healthy for the forest, but they don't let them get out of hand. So there's some very interesting new data from the fossil records of cores in the bottoms of some lakes. You can't get data from rivers in Australia because they're ephemeral. They dry. There's no water flowing at parts of the year, so there's no carbon record in the sediments. But they have some lakes where they've got sediment coring, and they've got a detailed record of the carbon content, the organic material, and the amount of rainfall, etc., in parts of Australia. And they find that the Indigenous people in Australia, the Aboriginals, have been dealing with fire and doing a good job for literally tens of thousands of years. So there's lots that we can do. We're just not doing it yet.
Thank you, Paul, for bringing up the importance of Indigenous knowledge. One of the big mistakes that we've made is thinking that we know more. This is always the problem of modern man, right? We know more, we're more sophisticated, we're more science-based. But we'd be wise to pay attention to those who've come before us.
I just want to quickly a research paper that I only just came across because of this emergency show that we're doing. So very important. It was published in December of last year. It's called Performance of Fire Danger Indices to the Continental United States. Now, it's a very impressive and shocking paper. I've never seen anything like this before. So they've tracked fires across the United States from 1985 to 2020. And they go up at a steady rate, both in size and number. Talk about impressive. So that's really, really important that the scientists have actually determined that applied to the US, as I say. But what's even more impressive, oh my God, is that on the map that they've got, which projects changes in the number of days of fires in the United States, right through the rest of this century, guess where the most red dots are? My God, Texas. There's a very, very large increase in fires projected affecting most of the United States, but way worse in the southern plains and Texas. Oklahoma, of course, which has experienced the same fires as Texas at this recent time, are Kansas. So that's the United States future. So yeah, they better bend some arms of their political representatives. Thanks.
Do we want to have our goodbye from Paul's new accomplice there? He can close the show.
My Newton, I've run out of dog cookies. I've been feeding him dog cookies. He's down in the basement with me, sort of never leaves my side. So this is like a little guest appearance from Newton. People have asked me to include him more in videos and so on. So Newton says hi to everybody.
Well, thank you, Paul, for introducing Newton to the Climate Emergency Forum and people in our audience. I'm sure they very much appreciate it. And I'm sure that Newton very much appreciates our topic on forest fires because no doubt he likes to romp through the land without any worry about singeing his little pads. So thank you so much, Newton, for making an appearance. Thank you, our viewers, for watching this show. Let's hope that they can stamp out that forest fire in northern Texas and Oklahoma before it spreads too far. We're sending our positive thoughts to everyone affected by this fire. It grieves us tremendously for the suffering that people are encountering due to anthropogenic climate change. And of course, it gives us no comfort to say that this is terribly sad and unfortunately it will continue. But for those who are suffering, please know that our thoughts are with you. If you have any experience in this particular fire and you want to share how it has affected you or your neighbors, please leave that information in the comments. Let's start a dialogue about how this affects people in real life, not just this theoretical discussion of it, but what's your experience of it? I'd like to hear. I'm sure we'd all like to hear. And we'd also like you to give this video a thumbs up and share it. If you haven't subscribed yet, what in the heck are you waiting for? We're waiting for you to be a part of the team here. Come on and join the forum, and we'll see you next time at the Climate Emergency Forum.